Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In one of our last videos, I drew a comparison between the infamous Separatist dreadnought, known as the Malevolence, and the real German battleship, known as the Bismarck. Now I did a little further digging around and lo and behold, in an interview, Dave Filoni, the supervising director of the Clone Wars TV series, stated that we wanted to have a Bismarck-style battleship for one of the first arcs in this series, which I think is really awesome because Star Wars has always been heavily influenced by World War II. And so the question I want to ask today is just how closely related are these two ships? How similar is the Malevolence and the Bismarck? Well, first let's compare these vessels side by side. The Malevolence was the lead ship of the subjugator class heavy cruiser. It was just one of two examples of this massive resource-intensive vessel, just like the Bismarck, which was the lead ship in the Bismarck class, and it was also one of two. Both of these ships were built in complete defiance of the conventions of the day, and I don't mean that these ships were trying to think outside the box or trying to be special or different. I mean these ships were both technically illegal according to, I guess, international treaties. The Confederacy of Independent Systems had to design and build the subjugator-class heavy cruiser in complete secrecy. For one, the Republic had no idea that the Separatist crisis would blow up into an all-out civil war. They also had no idea that the Separatists were manufacturing a massive droid army and naval force in the Outer Rim. On top of that, the Republic was still in the post-Rusan Reformation period, which meant that the federal military was completely demilitarized. And most of the federal military's resources have been disassembled and redirected to local planetary defense forces. It's actually very similar to what the New Republic would do shortly after the Galactic Civil War ended. Limitations were also placed on the tonnage of vessels along with what kind of weapons they could carry on board. And at the same time, not only was it illegal for them to build the subjugator-class heavy cruiser, there was just a limited amount of expertise in the galaxy left and enough shipyards who can actually handle an operation of this size. In order to be good at building battleships, you have to continue to build battleships. For instance, if the United States needed to build a battleship today, which would make zero sense, of course, we would still have the technology and know-how to do it, but we might not have the industrial capabilities, the skilled labor to do this, and so it would cost a lot of money, just the initial investment to build the facilities to build something like this. I mean, the whole casting process alone for a battleship is an intense process. It's far more intense than what you would have for an aircraft carrier. The material science and knowledge required to build a 16-inch gun is also something that is probably lost, or at least very difficult to replicate today. Probably gonna have to ask the Adeptus Mechanicus to pray to the machine gods for blueprints, or something like that. The Confederacy of Independent Systems would eventually commission the design of the subjugator and put Rugal Schmong, a Sullivan shipwright, in charge of the project. Basically, Schmong was able to take some blueprints he'd probably, stolen from the time he worked at Soros Sub, and he used that as the basis for the subjugator class. The ship itself would be built in secret by Corps and engineers of the Free DAC Volunteers Engineering Corps on the planet of Pamant, out of sight of Republic officials. Now, we're going to see some similarities between the Malevolence and Bismarck and how they come to life. For the German Navy, the end of World War I resulted in the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed heavy punishment on the German nation after their defeat. The most damaging aspect of this treaty was Article 231, also known as the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept complete responsibility for starting World War I and therefore made them legally responsible for all the damages done during the conflict. In hindsight, this was a ridiculous idea, and the French really pushed this idea, and once again, I don't think the French get enough blame for all the bloodshed that's happened in the last 2-3 centuries in Europe. They've caused a lot of damage. I don't understand this image they have as this benign and very liberal, forward-thinking nation. They're just as savage as everyone else is. The French were even more adamant than the British about the Germans paying war reparations, and this more or less destroyed the entire German economy, which of course creates the economic conditions to allow Adolf Hitler to come to power. And yes, I really don't think without these war reparations that Germany would have become so extreme after World War I. Just how bad were the economic conditions? Well, in the summer of 1922, the German mark's exchange rate was about 320 to $1. By December, it was 7,400 German marks to $1. That's an inflation rate of almost 2,000%. To put that into modern terms, a $2 Milky Way would increase in price to $42. Damn. And get this, by November 1923, less than a year later, the mark was trading at 4,210,500 million marks to $1. That's an inflation rate of 56.9 billion%. That means that $42 Milky Way seems probably reasonable now, because now it costs $24 million. But yeah, this is why people were burning money left and right for fuel and falling into the trap of fascism. I'm sorry about getting sidetracked, but economic damage is horrific. I mean, what happens to Germany post-World War I could have completely been prevented had France just been a little more chilled out. And instead what happens is Germany becomes extreme and it blows up right in France's face just a few decades later. Although, in all fairness, the French did pay Germany back by capitulating completely and donating a good portion of their military power to the Nazi cause. Anyway, back to the Bismarck. This thing was technically illegal, according to the Versailles Treaty. The Versailles Treaty stated that the German Navy couldn't build ships any larger than 10,000 tons. The Bismarck takes dumps in the morning that are bigger than 10,000 tons, and, the German military never really kind of treated the Treaty of Versailles as a serious thing. They just always skirted around it, just like how the First Order didn't really respect the new republics, demilitarization after the Galactic Civil War ended. What the Germans did try to follow a little bit was the Washington Naval Treaty, and that's because a lot more major powers actually signed on to that, including many of the major powers for the next World War, ranging from Italy to Japan to the entire British Empire. Now, this treaty would increase the tonnage for capital ships to 35,000 tons, which was a lot more reasonable. And so the Bismarck and her sister Tirpitz seemed to make the way in after significant dehydration and sauna use. But of course, what actually happened was the Germans did some creative calculations. They probably had some future Volkswagen employees working in this project as well. You see, the Bismarck didn't actually weigh 35,000 tons. It weighed closer to 43,000 tons. And that really matters a lot. You see, there were ships that were longer than the Bismarck, like the HMS Hood, but very few ships in the interwar period and the early World War II period could actually match the Bismarck in displacement. And the Bismarck was super heavy because it was one of the most heavily armored things that could actually float in the world. This ship also had a blistering top speed of 31 knots. In comparison, the Nelson class, which displaced around 33,000 tons, only had a top speed of 23 knots. Even the newer King George V class battleship, with its displacement of 37,000 tons, only had a top speed of 28 knots. Ships of both of these classes would actually try to chase down the Bismarck, but again, it had a huge advantage in speed, armor, and even firepower. It was just a very deadly machine. Oh, we didn't even talk about the firepower yet. It had 8 15-inch guns and 81 additional gun emplacements of various sizes. I mean, that's enough fire support to match like an artillery brigade. It's absolutely insane. Now let's get back to the Malevolence. This ship was also massive, and it completely outclassed its enemy, far more than the Bismarck ever did. When we compare the Malevolence to the ships the Republic sent out to pursue it, the Venator-class Star Destroyer, the Subjugator class is nearly 5 times longer, at 4,845 meters to the Venator's 1,000 meters. Now the Republic did have larger command ships that were bigger than the Venator, but they never sent them after the Malevolence for one reason or another. The Malevolence was also an extremely fast ship for its size. With 16 sublight engines, it could outpace even the swift Venator at sublight speeds. But what truly made it terrifying was its offensive power. The ship had 2 mega ion cannons, which were proprietary super weapons that could fire out an energy projectile large enough to encompass entire fleets. On top of that, this ship had 500 twin turbo laser batteries, but oddly, just 5-point defense light laser cannon batteries. Kind of reminds me of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, except this thing had like 10 times the firepower. The Malevolence also had decks upon decks of armor, only made more potent because the Subjugator class was heavily automated, like most Separatist ships, and so large portions of the ship could be vented into space without hurting the crew on board or affecting their ability to do their jobs. The ship also had an early variant of the shield generators that would be used on the Imperial-class Star Destroyer and Executor-class Star Destroyer. Its defenses were no joke. Now, a combination of all these weapons and defenses and its secretive construction and design phase meant that the Malevolence basically was tearing around the galaxy for weeks, months, without anyone knowing what the hell was going on. The ship was essentially able to take out entire Republic fleets with just one blast from its ion cannon, and then would proceed to kill everyone on board to disable ships with its turbo lasers. The Confederacy would then send out small patrol teams to wipe out any survivors in escape pods. It was a gruesome strategy, but it worked. It sent the entire Republic in panic. Not even the Jedi knew what to do. Especially after Plo Koon's fleet was sent to investigate and disappeared as well. I mean, the situation was becoming even more confusing. Now, eventually Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano would take a civilian freighter to the last known location of Plo Koon's fleet and discover the existence of this Malevolence, which would lead to a massive hunt for the ship. Now, back to the Bismarck. It was nowhere near as dangerous in ship-to-ship combat as the Subjugator, but it posed a very unique threat to the entire war effort for the Allies. The combination of armor, firepower, speed simply was unheard of, and it was clear that the Germans wanted to release the Bismarck into the open waters of the Atlantic, where it could cause havoc for Allied shipping lanes. The United States Lend-and-Lease Act was shipping billions of dollars of goods that kept both the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union in the fight against Germany. Any disruption of the flow of supplies would have led to food, oil, and material shortages in the UK and completely destroyed the Soviet logistics network, which was heavily dependent on American jeeps, trucks, aircraft, tractors, and other vehicles. The US and the British Commonwealth also provided roughly 55% of the aluminum the Soviet Union used and up to 80% of the copper they used for building machines. Now, Stalin, and probably Putin, would never admit this publicly, but, Nikita Khrushchev once wrote in his memoirs, quote, "One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost the war." No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversation with me. I mean, this was really America's biggest contribution to that war, and it was our economic might. It was our ability to retool our factories and go from producing refrigerators to tanks within just a few months. So imagine letting this German battleship loose in the Atlantic where it could just go around and take out one convoy at a time. This would completely disrupt the flow of supplies to our allies. Well, actually, the United States was not in the war yet, but, we were kind of allied. And so preventing the Bismarck from entering the Atlantic became a huge priority for the Royal Navy. Now, if you take a look at the map of Germany, you'll see that they are landlocked in every direction except for the North Sea, and the only way from the North Sea to the wider Atlantic is around that little pesky island that produces some of the finest sailors and naval vessels in human history. And thanks to some friendly elements in the Swedish Navy, the second the Bismarck went on its first raid towards the Atlantic, the British fleet was prepared to intercept this massive ship. Although specifications of the Bismarck's armor, its speed, were just unknown, and this is probably what leads to the British being completely unprepared for this first skirmish. Battlecruiser HMS Hood and newly commissioned HMS Prince of Wales and 6 destroyers along with 18 bombers were dispatched to intercept the German battleship as it tried to make it towards the Atlantic through the Northern Sea. This would result in the Battle of Denmark Strait. The Bismarck and German cruiser Prince Eugene would engage the British fleet, and they would end up striking the HMS Hood's rear magazine, causing the ship to explode. Out of the 1,419 men on the ship, only 3 would survive. Such was the devastation of battleship-on-battleship conflict. This is probably why these kind of engagements were rare in human history. Now, the HMS Prince of Wales managed to land 3 shots on the Bismarck, forcing it to return back to Vichy-occupied France for repairs. The sacrifice of the Hood, which, charged directly at the Bismarck, guns blazing, would ultimately prevent the Bismarck from escaping to the open seas. British infantry during World War II were oftentimes known for being overly cautious, but their navy was always super aggressive and kind of insane. Such is the dynamic of an island nation. The army is really just built for defense, and the Navy is designed to make sure that that army never needs to be tested. So once the HMS Hood was destroyed with all those men on board, the entire Royal Navy, like sharks smelling blood in the water, started honing in on the wounded Bismarck. Now back to the Malevolence. After it was discovered, it managed to fly to another system where it would engage another fleet of Venator-class Star Destroyers and medical frigates and destroy them all. The next target for the vessel would be the Qaeda Shoals Medical Center, a completely undefended military hospital with over 60,000 wounded clones on board. Nalase was there as well, actually, for all of you Bad Batch fans. The approach that the Republic takes is quite smart. Realizing that their larger and slower capital ships were just sitting ducks for the Malevolence's mega ion cannons, the Republic would instead use squadrons of Y-wing bombers to target the weapon itself. The hope was that if they could disable the ion cannons, then the rest of the fleet could engage in actual combat with the Malevolence. Anakin Skywalker Plo Koon lead the assault and barely managed to escape the ion cannon's blast before getting beneath its firing arc. Several proton torpedoes later, the Malevolence had lost its main weapons, but was still quite a formidable ship. A fleet of 3 Venator-class Star Destroyers would immediately jump into the local system, led by Obi-Wan Kenobi and Wolf Yularen. They would give chase to the superweapon. Hits to the hyperdrive and stabilizers meant that the warship was unable to get away from the Republic, but again, this thing ate up turbolaser fire like a planetary body. Whatever the Venator-class Star Destroyer was packing, it just wasn't enough. The Republic would end up sending a small strike force on board the ship, and while on board, these Republic operators managed to sabotage the hyperdrive navigation system so that once the Separatists got the hyperdrive running once again, instead of jumping to the safety of their territory, they would jump right into a nearby moon. Thus ends the legendary run of the Malevolence. Now, the Bismarck would meet a similar fate, with Allied naval and air assets in pursuit, and the only friendly dry dock capable of repairing them in France. Time was a complete limit. German Naval Command tried to scramble all Atlantic U-boats in the area to help screen the Bismarck's return back to port, and at the same time, Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered all surface warships in the area to pursue the Bismarck as well. In total, 6 battleships and battlecruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers were committed to this chase. And just like the Republic, the British were able to use their carriers to track and harass the Bismarck with swordfish torpedo bombers. One torpedo manages to strike the vessel. Although the damage wasn't that big, the evasive maneuvers that the Bismarck tried to make while evading these torpedoes did further damage to the ship and eventually leads to the destruction of another cooler. boiler, sorry. Now, despite all this, the Bismarck was still capable of traveling around 28 knots, roughly the top speed of the King George V class of battleships. The Prince of Wales, which had already landed 3 successful shots on the Bismarck, was in close pursuit as well, and occasionally exchanging fire with the Bismarck. But the internal damage to the Bismarck further slowed it down to around 16 knots. Now, some on-the-spot repairs would allow the Bismarck to travel a little further, but the situation was not looking good. But then the pursuing Allied fleet was forced to adopt zigzag maneuvers to avoid U-boats in the area from targeting them. And this is what allows the Bismarck to almost escape. But the British, who had access to the German Enigma machine's encryption codes, were able to intercept Luftwaffe orders to provide support for the Bismarck on its approach to the French port of Brest. And this is what gave the Allied forces the information they needed to intercept. The Bismarck would eventually be spotted some 790 miles northwest of Brest, but with the majority of the British fleet running out of fuel, once again it was up to aircraft carriers to harass and keep track of this mighty ship. A British swordfish managed to strike the Bismarck in her stern on the port side, damaging the rudder so badly that it could no longer move. This marked the beginning of the end for the Bismarck, as it could now only steam in circles. Several British battleships and heavy cruisers, still with enough fuel, started steaming towards its location. Several Allied destroyers would make first contact with the Bismarck and stay shadowing the ship. In the final battle against the Bismarck, the British fleet would fire 2,800 shells, including 700 large caliber main gun shells at the Bismarck. The impressive warship took around 400 direct hits, a testament to the strength of this ship's armor and design. But the truth is, the Bismarck was doomed for failure from the second it was built. The Royal Navy heavily outnumbered the German Navy. It was just a matter of time when the two sides would meet. The biggest thing that the Bismarck ultimately accomplished was freezing up all of those Allied naval assets. But ultimately, concentrating all of your resources into one ship, into one gigantic station, is a terrible idea. Even the Malevolence, which was far more successful in its mission to cause terror, would be taken down by the overwhelming power of the Republic Navy.